Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one that quietly changes the lives of people you'll never expect. 20 black luxury SUVs stretched along the quiet suburban street, their headlights cutting through the rain like rows of pale stars, while neighbors stood frozen behind glowing windows, whispering to each other without daring to step outside. No one could understand why a convoy that looked as if it belonged to a foreign dignitary had stopped in front of a modest brick apartment building where nothing extraordinary had ever happened. What none of them knew was that less than an hour earlier, Claire Dawson had simply finished another exhausting shift at the rehabilitation clinic and was thinking about leftover soup waiting in her refrigerator. The October rain had settled over northern New Jersey with the steady rhythm that always made the streets feel lonelier after sunset. Water shimmered across cracked sidewalks, traffic lights reflected in puddles like scattered pieces of broken glass, and the cold wind slipped beneath Claire's light jacket as she hurried toward the parking lot carrying a worn canvas tote filled with patient notes she still planned to finish before bed. Her 12-year-old sedan complained every time she started it, but tonight it started on the first try, and she smiled at that tiny victory before easing onto the nearly empty road. It had been a long day filled with recovering stroke patients learning to take uncertain steps again, elderly veterans refusing to give up despite aching joints, and families clinging to hope one careful exercise at a time. Those stories stayed with her long after she clocked out. Maybe that was why she noticed the elderly woman standing alone beneath a flickering streetlight while every other driver passed without slowing down. The woman wore an elegant cream-colored coat that was far too thin for the chilly rain. Silver hair framed a gentle face filled with confusion instead of fear. She wasn't waving for help. She simply stood there, looking from one end of the street to the other, as if every direction had become equally unfamiliar. Claire pulled to the curb almost without thinking. She lowered the passenger window just enough to keep the rain from pouring inside. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she called softly. The older woman turned toward the sound of her voice with a warm but uncertain smile. "I think I was walking home," she answered, "but I can't remember which way home is." Claire stepped out into the rain. Up close, she noticed polished shoes splashed with muddy water and a delicate pearl bracelet that suggested this woman belonged somewhere far different from the quiet neighborhood around them. "Do you have someone I can call?" Claire asked. The woman searched through a designer handbag with trembling fingers before pulling out a small leather card holder. There was no driver's license inside, only a neatly folded card with a home address and a simple instruction written beneath it. "If found, please help me return home safely." "Thank you." Claire felt a quiet ache settle in her chest. She had worked with enough patients experiencing early memory loss to recognize familiar signs. The woman wasn't careless. She was trying her best to stay independent in a world that had begun quietly changing around her. "You're not very far," Claire said with a reassuring smile. "Why don't I drive you home?" The woman looked relieved enough that tears almost appeared in her pale blue eyes. "You're very kind," she whispered. "My son always says I shouldn't wander alone anymore." Claire helped her into the warm passenger seat, adjusted the heater, and handed her a clean bottle of water from the center console. As they drove through rain-darkened streets lined with glowing maple trees, the woman spoke in scattered memories that drifted in and out like distant radio stations. She remembered baking lemon cake every Sunday. She remembered teaching someone how to tie a necktie before an important meeting. She remembered her son's favorite homemade pasta when he was little. But every time Claire gently asked his name, the woman paused, frowned apologetically, and admitted she couldn't remember it for more than a few seconds. Somehow that seemed even sadder than forgetting an address. Less than a mile away, hidden behind stone walls and security gates, dozens of professionals had already begun searching for the missing woman with growing urgency. Phones continued ringing inside an estate where no one dared deliver bad news without absolute certainty. Unfortunately for Claire, she had no way of knowing that her quiet decision to stop beside a lonely streetlight had already changed the course of her ordinary life. Her GPS instructed her to turn onto a private road bordered by towering oak trees, and the modest neighborhoods disappeared behind wrought iron fencing unlike anything she had ever seen. At the end of the winding driveway stood an enormous mansion glowing softly against the rain, every window illuminated as if the entire house had been waiting for someone to come home. Before Claire could even place the car into park, the front gate swung fully open, security lights flooded the driveway, and somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, The unmistakable sound of dozens of engines approached all at once. The deep growl of approaching engines rolled across the estate before Claire fully understood what she was hearing. One after another, black luxury sport utility vehicles swept through the open gates with perfect precision, their headlights illuminating sheets of rain that shimmered across the long stone driveway. Every vehicle stopped at almost the exact same moment, creating a silent line that seemed more choreographed than natural. Claire instinctively glanced toward the elderly woman beside her, but Eleanor Romano simply smiled with gentle relief, as though everything had finally returned to where it belonged. Men in dark tailored suits stepped from the vehicles with calm discipline rather than urgency. None of them raised their voices, none of them appeared panicked, yet every movement carried the unmistakable weight of responsibility. Before Claire could even reach for the door handle, one of the men approached her window with respectful restraint. "Miss, thank you for bringing her home safely," he said. "Please remain where you are for just a moment." Claire nodded, unsure whether she had accidentally driven into the home of a famous politician, a billionaire, or someone whose life demanded extraordinary protection. The mansion itself glowed warmly behind towering columns, every light inside reflecting across polished marble floors visible through enormous windows. Several members of the household hurried outside carrying umbrellas, but none of them reached Eleanor before another vehicle slowly stopped in the center of the driveway. Unlike the others, its rear door opened only after several quiet seconds. A tall man stepped into the rain without accepting the umbrella immediately offered to him. His charcoal overcoat darkened beneath the steady drizzle as he walked directly toward Claire's aging sedan. He moved neither quickly nor dramatically, yet everyone else seemed to instinctively give him space. Claire noticed the details before she noticed the man himself. Expensive leather shoes darkened by rain without any sign of concern. Calm hands, straight posture, eyes that quietly examined everything before settling on the passenger seat. Eleanor looked up and smiled with unmistakable recognition. "There you are," she said softly. "I knew you would come." The man's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The controlled composure remained, but relief briefly softened his features. He opened the passenger door himself instead of asking anyone else to help. "You had everyone worried," he said gently. "I am sorry," Eleanor replied with visible embarrassment. "I forgot which street I was on." "You came home," he answered. "That is all that matters." Claire watched the exchange without speaking. Whatever authority this man possessed seemed to disappear in those quiet seconds beside his mother. He carefully helped her stand, making certain she kept her balance before allowing anyone else to approach. Eleanor lightly touched his cheek with surprising affection. "This young woman stayed with me," she said. "She never rushed me. She even turned the heater on because my hands were cold." His eyes lifted toward Claire for the first time. They were steady, observant, and impossible to read completely. "My name is Sebastian Romano," he said. "There are not enough words to properly thank you." Claire climbed out of her car, brushing damp strands of hair behind her ear. "There is no need to thank me." She needed help. Anyone would have done the same. Sebastian looked at her for another quiet moment before giving the smallest shake of his head. "Not everyone stops." The simple sentence carried more weight than any dramatic speech could have. Around them, the estate gradually relaxed. Staff members exchanged relieved smiles. Security personnel quietly stepped back. The invisible tension that had filled the property only minutes earlier dissolved into something much calmer. Sebastian accepted an umbrella only after his mother had safely reached the front steps. Before following her inside, he turned back toward Claire once again. "Please allow us to express our gratitude," he said. "Dinner, a car, anything you may need." Claire smiled politely and closed her car door. "I appreciate the offer, but I really should head home. I have work tomorrow morning." One of the older housekeepers looked genuinely surprised, as though declining such an invitation almost never happened. Sebastian himself remained perfectly composed. "Then at least let one of my drivers escort you home." Claire laughed softly, but because the idea felt completely unnecessary. "I drove here just fine. I promise I can drive back." For the first time, the faintest trace of amusement reached Sebastian's eyes. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Very well," he said, "but if circumstances are ever different, I hope you will allow me the opportunity to return your kindness." Claire nodded once before stepping back into her sedan. As she slowly turned toward the open gates, she glanced once in the rearview mirror. Eleanor was standing beneath the mansion's entrance lights, waving with both hands like a grateful grandmother saying goodbye after Sunday dinner. Beside her, Sebastian remained completely still, watching the old sedan disappear into the rainy night. What Claire could not possibly know was that less than 5 minutes after her taillights vanished beyond the estate walls, Sebastian quietly asked for every available detail about the woman who had expected absolutely nothing in return. Claire expected the extraordinary evening to become nothing more than a strange story she might someday tell over coffee, but by sunrise it already felt unreal, as though the rain had washed the entire experience away with the puddles lining the streets. Her alarm rang at 6 o'clock, and within an hour she was walking through the familiar halls of the rehabilitation clinic, where polished tile floors, soft conversations, and the steady rhythm of physical therapy sessions replaced the quiet luxury of the enormous estate. Patients greeted her by name. An elderly veteran proudly showed that he could climb one more practice step without assistance. A middle-aged teacher recovering from surgery laughed after finally buttoning her own sweater again. Those small victories mattered far more to Claire than expensive cars or grand mansions ever could. By lunchtime, the previous night had settled into the back of her mind like an unusual dream. She assumed she would never see Eleanor Romano again. Less than 10 miles away, another morning unfolded very differently. Fresh flowers had already been placed throughout the Romano estate before breakfast, while staff quietly resumed their routines after the night's unexpected scare. Eleanor sat near a sunlit window with a cup of tea resting between both hands. Some memories escaped her almost as quickly as they arrived, yet one remained remarkably clear. "The kind young woman," she said softly for what must have been the 4th time that morning. Did someone's keeper smiled politely. "Yes, Mrs. Romano." Eleanor frowned with gentle uncertainty. "I do not think we thanked her enough." Across the room, Sebastian looked up from several neatly organized folders without interrupting her. He had heard the same sentence more than once already, yet each repetition carried the same quiet sincerity. His mother rarely remembered details after wandering episodes, but somehow she remembered Claire's patience, her reassuring voice, and the warmth of the heater inside an aging sedan. That alone made Sebastian pause longer than he normally would. "Find out where she works," he instructed calmly to one of his assistants. "Only the basics. I am not interested in invading her privacy." The assistant nodded immediately. Of course, Sebastian returned to his paperwork, although his attention wandered more than usual. During years of responsibility, he had learned that favors almost always carried expectations. Gratitude often arrived attached to requests. Generosity frequently concealed ambition. Yet Claire had accepted nothing. She had declined transportation, declined gifts, and declined every comfortable opportunity placed before her. That was uncommon enough to remain on his mind long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Claire spent the afternoon helping a retired carpenter strengthen his injured shoulder. She demonstrated slow movements, encouraged every small improvement, and celebrated progress that most people would never notice. Her co-workers admired the way she never rushed patients who struggled. "You always have more patience than the rest of us," another therapist joked while organizing exercise bands. Claire laughed quietly. "Everyone deserves enough time to finish the hard parts." She had no idea those exact words would soon be repeated elsewhere. Late that afternoon, a neatly dressed courier entered the clinic carrying an elegant white box wrapped with a dark blue ribbon. Every receptionist looked up at once. "Delivery for Miss Claire Dawson," the man announced politely. Claire walked toward the front desk with visible confusion. She was not expecting flowers, packages, or surprises of any kind. Inside the box rested a handwritten note beside a simple bouquet of white lilies. There were no expensive decorations, no extravagant gifts, and no oversized displays of wealth. The note contained only one sentence: "Thank you for bringing my mother home safely. Sebastian Romano." Nothing more. No business card, no phone number, no invitation. Claire smiled despite herself. The gesture felt unexpectedly thoughtful because it stopped exactly where gratitude should stop. She placed the flowers in a glass pitcher normally used for patient celebrations, and throughout the afternoon several recovering patients commented on how beautiful they looked beside the therapy windows. As the clinic closed for the evening, Claire gathered her belongings and carried the bouquet to her car. The sky had finally cleared after 2 straight days of rain, leaving the autumn air crisp beneath fading golden light. She glanced once at the handwritten note before placing it carefully inside her tote bag instead of throwing it away. It was a small decision, one she barely noticed herself. Unfortunately for Claire, someone else had also noticed her routine during the past 2 days. From a parked vehicle across the street, a man quietly lowered a pair of binoculars after watching her leave the building. He was not interested in Claire herself. His attention had been fixed on something much smaller, the white lilies resting on the passenger seat beside her. As her old sedan disappeared into evening traffic, he reached for his phone, spoke only a few calm words, and ended the call before the screen went dark. Saturday mornings usually carried a slower rhythm inside the rehabilitation clinic. Sunlight spilled through wide front windows, warming the waiting room where patients chatted over coffee while soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers. Claire Dawson preferred those quieter shifts because they gave her time to notice the little victories that often disappeared during busy weekdays. She was adjusting resistance bands for an elderly patient recovering from hip surgery when the receptionist walked toward her with an uncertain smile. "Claire, there is someone asking for you." Expecting a family member of one of her patients, Claire stepped into the lobby and stopped in surprise. Eleanor Romano sat comfortably beside the window, dressed in a pale blue sweater with a light scarf wrapped neatly around her shoulders. She smiled the instant she recognized Claire. "I remembered where you worked today," she said proudly, "so I asked them to bring me." Claire immediately knelt beside her chair with genuine warmth. "It is wonderful to see you again. How have you been feeling?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. Some mornings are clearer than others. She tapped the side of her temple with gentle humor. "This little thing likes to play tricks on me." Claire laughed softly, but behind her smile she recognized the familiar courage shared by many patients who quietly accepted changes they could not control. Standing a few feet away was Sebastian Romano, wearing a dark sport coat instead of the formal overcoat she remembered from the rainy evening. Without the dramatic arrival of dozens of vehicles, he looked almost like any successful executive accompanying his mother to a medical appointment. Almost. Still an unmistakable calm surrounding him, the kind carried by someone accustomed to responsibility. "Good morning," he said politely. "My mother insisted on seeing you herself." Claire stood and smiled. She certainly did not have to come all this way just to say hello. Eleanor reached into her handbag and carefully removed a small plastic container covered with a floral lid. "I baked lemon cake," she announced with unmistakable pride. "Well, I helped bake it." She looked toward Sebastian with playful uncertainty. "Did I help?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "You supervise very carefully." Claire accepted the container with both hands as though it was something priceless. "This may be the nicest thank you I have ever received." Eleanor looked genuinely relieved. "Good. I wanted to remember this time." Those simple words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Claire gently changed the subject before sadness could settle over the conversation. "Would you like to see our therapy garden? The roses are still blooming." Eleanor's eyes brightened immediately. "I would love that." Sebastian quietly remained a few steps behind as Claire slowly walked beside Eleanor through the small courtyard. Autumn leaves drifted across brick pathways while fountains created a peaceful background that softened every conversation. Claire noticed Eleanor occasionally searching for words before finding them again, but she also noticed something encouraging. Familiar surroundings and patient conversation seemed to reduce her confusion considerably. They paused beside a bench surrounded by white roses. Eleanor reached toward one blossom without picking it. "Beautiful things should stay where everyone can enjoy them," she whispered. Claire nodded. "I think that is true about people too." Sebastian heard the exchange from several feet away. He said nothing, but the words settled quietly in his memory. As they returned toward the entrance, Eleanor suddenly stopped walking. Her expression changed only slightly, yet Claire recognized the subtle hesitation immediately. "Is everything all right?" Claire asked gently. Eleanor looked down at the small notebook she carried inside her purse. "I thought today's appointment was on Tuesday." Claire carefully opened the notebook after receiving permission. Most pages contained neatly written reminders in large handwriting, medication times, family birthdays, grocery lists. One recent page caught her attention because a scheduled appointment had been crossed out and rewritten twice in different handwriting. Claire frowned almost imperceptibly before closing the notebook. "Sometimes schedules become confusing," she said kindly. Eleanor smiled, apparently satisfied with the explanation, but Claire quietly wondered why the handwriting looked so different. It could have been perfectly innocent, a family member, a household employee, someone simply helping. Still, something about the altered appointment bothered her professional instincts. Less than a mile away, another envelope was being placed inside an outgoing courier bag addressed to the Romano estate. No one there yet realized its contents included paperwork based on information that no longer matched Eleanor's current medical condition. Back at the clinic entrance, Sebastian thanked Claire once again for spending time with his mother. "She has smiled more this morning than she has all week," he admitted. Claire looked toward Eleanor, who was happily telling the receptionist about her lemon cake recipe. "She does not need expensive gifts," Claire replied quietly. "She needs familiar routines and people who let her keep as much independence as she safely can." Sebastian studied her expression for a long moment before answering. "Then perhaps I still have much to learn." Claire offered a polite smile, believing the conversation had ended, but as Eleanor climbed into the waiting vehicle, she turned back unexpectedly. "Do not forget Tuesday," she called cheerfully. Claire blinked in confusion because no plans had ever been made for Tuesday, and judging by the thoughtful look crossing Sebastian's face, he realized exactly the same thing. Tuesday arrived with unusually bright skies, the kind of clear autumn morning that made the entire town seem calmer than it truly was. Claire Dawson almost dismissed Eleanor Romano's unexpected farewell from a few days earlier as another harmless mix of fading memories until the clinic receptionist informed her that a visitor had arrived exactly at 10 o'clock. Standing near the entrance was the same chauffeur she had briefly seen outside the Romano estate. He held a sealed envelope rather than flowers. "Mrs. Romano asked me to deliver this personally," he said with respectful formality. Claire thanked him and waited until he had returned to the waiting vehicle before opening it. Inside rested a handwritten invitation on thick cream-colored stationery. Eleanor would be spending the afternoon in the estate's botanical garden and hoped Claire might join her for tea if her schedule allowed. At the bottom, a short note had been added in Sebastian Romano's precise handwriting. "There is absolutely no obligation. My mother simply remembered your kindness." Claire hesitated only long enough to rearrange one afternoon appointment with another therapist before driving toward the estate. She reminded herself that this visit was for Eleanor, not for the impressive home or the mysterious family who lived behind its gates. The towering iron entrance opened before she reached the intercom, as though her arrival had already been expected. This time the enormous property felt less intimidating and more peaceful. Carefully maintained gardens stretched across rolling hills, fountains reflected the blue afternoon sky, and winding stone paths disappeared beneath maple trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor was already waiting beneath a white gazebo overlooking a small lake. She waved enthusiastically the moment Claire stepped onto the garden path. "I remembered Tuesday," she announced proudly before Claire could say hello. "You certainly did," Claire answered with a warm smile. "And I am very glad you invited me." A table had been prepared with tea, fresh fruit, and slices of homemade lemon cake that looked remarkably better than Eleanor had claimed. Sebastian joined them only long enough to greet Claire before quietly excusing himself for business elsewhere on the property. The conversation remained wonderfully ordinary. Eleanor spoke about flowers she could still identify without hesitation, birds that returned every spring, and recipes passed down through generations of her family. Claire noticed how nature seemed to anchor Eleanor's memory more effectively than dates or schedules ever could. Certain scents, familiar colors, and old traditions reached places that confusion could not completely erase. After tea, they wandered slowly through the garden. Eleanor occasionally stopped to admire roses or gently touch the bark of old oak trees whose names she recalled immediately. Claire admired the quiet patience shown by the estate staff. They never corrected Eleanor harshly when she forgot something. They simply guided conversations back toward what remained familiar. It was compassionate care, yet one small detail continued quietly bothering Claire. Whenever Eleanor reached into her purse to check her notebook, several recent appointments appeared scratched out and rewritten in noticeably different handwriting. During one pause beside a greenhouse, Eleanor frowned at a page before looking up at Claire with visible uncertainty. "I was supposed to meet someone last Thursday," she said softly. "Or perhaps it was next Thursday. I cannot remember anymore." Claire accepted the notebook again with permission and carefully examined the page. Whoever had rewritten the entries pressed unusually hard with the pen, leaving deep marks across the paper. Some appointments had disappeared entirely. Others had been moved to different dates without explanation. "Has someone been helping organize your schedule?" Claire asked gently. Eleanor smiled. "Sometimes one of the assistants fixes things for me. Everyone says they are helping." The answer sounded perfectly reasonable, yet Claire could not ignore the uneasy feeling growing quietly inside her. Professional experience had taught her that consistency mattered greatly for patients experiencing early memory loss. Constantly changing routines often increased confusion instead of reducing it. As they continued walking, they passed a sunroom where several household employees organized mail on a long wooden table. One thick envelope accidentally slid onto the floor as someone hurried by. Claire instinctively picked it up before it could be stepped on. The return address belonged to a respected neurological clinic. Before she handed it back, she noticed the envelope had already been opened and carefully resealed. She thought little of it until the employee accepted it with an expression that seemed surprisingly nervous for such an ordinary mistake. "Thank you," the woman said quickly before disappearing inside without another word. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it lingered in Claire's thoughts long afterward. Unfortunately for her, someone else had witnessed the entire exchange from an upstairs office window. Sebastian watched Claire return to the garden beside his mother, noticing how naturally Eleanor laughed in her company. He also noticed the brief conversation involving the opened medical envelope. He said nothing. There was not enough information to justify suspicion. Still, when his longtime estate manager entered the office moments later, Sebastian calmly asked a question he had never felt compelled to ask before. "Who has been managing my mother's appointments during the past 6 months?" The manager answered immediately with complete confidence, but for reasons he could not yet explain, Sebastian found himself looking once more toward the garden below, where Claire had paused beside Eleanor after noticing that another page had quietly disappeared from the little notebook. The peaceful afternoon at the Romano estate should have ended as quietly as it began, but the weather shifted with surprising speed. Thick grey clouds rolled across the sky, carrying sharp autumn winds that sent thousands of golden leaves swirling through the gardens. Claire Dawson looked up just as Eleanor Romano paused near a stone footbridge, crossing a narrow decorative stream. "The rain is coming," Claire said gently. "Let us head back inside." Eleanor nodded at first, but halfway across the bridge she suddenly stopped walking. Her eyes wandered beyond the trees toward another winding path. "I know that place," she whispered. "Your father is waiting for us." Claire immediately recognized the subtle confusion that sometimes accompanied familiar landscapes. She did not correct Eleanor directly. Instead, she slowly stepped beside her. "Why do we not find a warm place first?" she suggested softly. "Then you can tell me about him." Eleanor smiled faintly but continued looking toward the distant path. Before Claire could guide her away, a strong gust of wind scattered leaves across the bridge, briefly blocking everyone's view. In those few distracted seconds, Eleanor quietly walked away in the opposite direction.
"Mrs. Romano?"
Claire called calmly, refusing to let panic enter her voice. There was no answer. She followed immediately, moving through the maze of garden paths while scanning every corner with the practiced awareness she had developed from years of working with patients living with memory disorders. Less than 100 yards away, estate employees also began searching after realizing Eleanor was no longer beside the gazebo. Unfortunately for Claire, no one noticed that she had already chosen the correct direction. The elderly woman had wandered toward an old glass conservatory at the edge of the property where ivy covered the stone walls and the air smelled of damp earth and roses. Claire finally spotted Eleanor standing quietly beside a weathered fountain, smiling at her own reflection in the water. "There you are," Claire said warmly as she approached without rushing. "I was beginning to miss our conversation." Eleanor looked up with visible relief. "I thought I was supposed to meet someone here." Claire gently offered her arm. "Perhaps we can wait together inside where it is warmer." Just then the first heavy drops of rain began falling through the trees. At almost the exact same moment, Sebastian Romano appeared from another garden path, followed by several members of the household who had spread across the estate searching in every direction. Relief crossed his face so quickly that it almost escaped unnoticed before his familiar composure returned. He walked directly toward his mother instead of speaking to anyone else. "You found the prettiest corner of the garden," he said with an easy smile. Eleanor laughed softly. "I always liked this fountain." Sebastian slipped his jacket over her shoulders before the rain became heavier. Only after making certain she was comfortable did he look toward Claire. "Thank you," he said quietly. Again, Claire shook her head. She did not go far. She simply followed a memory. As they slowly walked back toward the mansion, Claire noticed something else. Eleanor repeatedly glanced at a small bronze plaque mounted near the conservatory entrance as though trying to remember why it mattered. The inscription had become difficult to read with age, but one line remained clear enough to recognize: dedicated to Eleanor Romano, Spring Garden Restoration, 15 years ago. Claire smiled. You helped create this garden. Eleanor looked surprised. Did I? Claire pointed gently toward the plaque. Your name is right there. Eleanor's expression brightened with genuine happiness. I remember the roses now. It was only a small moment, yet Claire understood how meaningful it could be. Familiar landmarks often awakened memories that conversation alone could not reach. Sebastian quietly observed the exchange without interrupting. For the first time, he saw someone helping his mother recover confidence instead of simply reminding her what she had forgotten. Back inside the mansion, warm towels and fresh tea appeared almost immediately. Rain tapped softly against enormous windows while Eleanor settled comfortably into her favorite chair. Sebastian invited Claire to remain until the storm passed. She accepted only because driving through heavy rain made little sense. As they sat in the library overlooking the gardens, Sebastian finally asked the question that had remained in his thoughts since their first meeting. How did you know where to look? Claire wrapped both hands around the warm teacup before answering. People living with memory changes rarely wander without a reason. They usually walk toward places that once made them feel safe. Sebastian remained silent for several thoughtful seconds. I have spent months trying to keep my mother from getting lost, he admitted quietly. You seem to understand how to help her find her way instead. Claire smiled gently. There is a difference. Before either of them could continue, one of the estate assistants entered carrying a leather folder. Mr. Romano, she said respectfully, these are the revised appointments for your mother's neurological evaluations. Sebastian accepted the folder without comment, but Claire noticed something immediately. The handwriting on the front page looked strikingly similar to the altered notes she had seen inside Eleanor's personal notebook. She said nothing because she had no proof that anything was wrong. Even so, as Sebastian casually placed the folder on the nearby table, a small silver emblem embossed on its corner caught her attention for the first time. It matched the same unfamiliar symbol she had noticed days earlier on several vehicles throughout the estate, and although she still did not understand what it represented, she suddenly realized it appeared almost everywhere Sebastian Romano went. The rain finally eased just before sunset, leaving the Romano estate wrapped in the quiet stillness that always followed a storm. Water still clung to the rose gardens, reflecting the amber glow of landscape lights, while the last drop slipped from the branches of old maple trees. Claire Dawson stood near the library window preparing to leave when her phone buzzed with a message from the rehabilitation clinic confirming her schedule for the following morning. She thanked the house staff for their hospitality, gathered her tote bag, and turned toward the front entrance, expecting another ordinary goodbye. Instead, she noticed an unusual silence spreading through the foyer. Several members of the household had instinctively stepped aside as another group of sharply dressed men entered from the east wing. They moved with practiced discipline, exchanging only brief nods before handing Sebastian Romano a thin folder embossed with the same silver emblem Claire had noticed several times before. Nobody spoke loudly, nobody appeared nervous. Yet the entire atmosphere changed in subtle ways she could not. A conversation stopped. The servants quietly redirected their attention elsewhere. Even the security staff adjusted their positions without being asked. Claire had worked around hospitals long enough to recognize when everyone in a room instinctively responded to a single person. This felt remarkably similar, only far more absolute. Sebastian accepted the folder without opening it immediately. He noticed Claire watching, and for the briefest moment their eyes met across the marble hallway. There was no embarrassment in his expression, only quiet acceptance, as though he understood she had begun noticing pieces of a much larger picture. Eleanor appeared at the top of the staircase just then, smiling warmly after changing into a comfortable sweater. "Claire, you are leaving already?" she asked with visible disappointment. Claire smiled back. "I promised my patients I would be well rested tomorrow." Eleanor nodded with understanding before looking toward her son. "Walk her outside. It is the polite thing to do." Sebastian closed the folder and crossed the foyer without hesitation. Neither of them spoke until they reached the front steps where the cool evening air carried the fresh scent of rain across the enormous grounds. Claire looked toward the long driveway where several black vehicles remained parked in perfect order. "You seem to have a great many people depending on you," she observed carefully. Sebastian followed her gaze. Responsibility has a way of growing over the years. It was an honest answer without actually answering the question. Claire hesitated before speaking again. May I ask you something? Of course. The symbol on those vehicles. I have seen it everywhere. The folder, the gates, even the cuff link some of your staff wear. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. The evening breeze gently stirred the oak trees surrounding the estate while distant thunder rolled beyond the hills. Finally, he looked directly at her. You deserve the truth before this friendship becomes unfair. Claire felt the weight behind those words immediately. My family oversees an organization that has existed for generations, Sebastian said calmly. Many people describe it with one word, Mafia. He did not lower his voice. He did not attempt to soften the statement or disguise it behind complicated explanations. He simply allowed the truth to exist between them. Claire searched his face, expecting arrogance, intimidation, or even a challenge. She found none of those things. She found only a man watching carefully to see whether honesty would end the conversation. The word itself echoed through her thoughts. Mafia. Countless movies, headlines, rumors, and exaggerated stories rushed through her mind all at once, yet none of them matched the man standing quietly before her. The same man who had knelt beside his confused mother in the rain. The same man who had thanked a stranger with flowers instead of money. The same man who had listened carefully when she explained routines for memory care. Claire took a slow breath before answering. I did not help your mother because of who your family is. Sebastian nodded once. I know. And I am not suddenly going to pretend she matters less because I learned something about you. For the first time since they had met, the restraint in Sebastian's expression gave way to genuine surprise. It lasted only a heartbeat before settling into quiet respect. Most people choose either fear or fascination after hearing that word, he admitted. You seem to have chosen neither. Claire looked back toward the illuminated mansion where Eleanor waved cheerfully from the library window, completely unaware of the conversation taking place outside. I chose to judge the people I have actually met, she replied softly. Your mother is kind. You have always treated me with respect. That is what I know. Sebastian lowered his eyes briefly, as though weighing her words more carefully than any business decision placed before him that day. Unfortunately for Claire, honesty had also changed something else. Less than a mile beyond the estate gates, a parked sedan slowly pulled away after watching the front entrance through a telephoto camera. The driver ended a brief phone call with only one sentence. She knows who he is now. Neither Claire nor Sebastian noticed the vehicle disappearing into the evening traffic. As Claire started her aging sedan and slowly drove toward the open gates, she glanced once in the rearview mirror. Sebastian remained exactly where she had left him, standing beneath the front lights of the estate without moving. For the first time since that rainy night beneath the lonely streetlight, Claire realized that helping one lost woman home had quietly placed her at the edge of a world she had never imagined, and she could not shake the growing feeling that turning away from it would no longer be as simple as driving home. Claire Dawson returned to her ordinary routine, believing that honesty had settled the questions surrounding Sebastian Romano. Yet the truth only seemed to uncover deeper ones. Monday morning filled the rehabilitation clinic with its familiar rhythm of careful encouragement, rolling therapy equipment, and patients celebrating victories so small that most people would never notice them. Claire focused on helping an elderly woman regain enough balance to walk across the room without assistance, but every so often her thoughts drifted toward the Romano estate. She did not think about wealth or power. She thought about Eleanor's smile when she remembered the roses, about the handwritten notebook with appointments that kept changing, and about the strange feeling that someone had been quietly rearranging the life of a woman who already struggled to trust her own memory. Late that afternoon, her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it until she noticed the local area code. Claire Dawson speaking, she answered. There was a brief pause before Sebastian's calm voice came through the speaker. I hope I am not interrupting your work. Not at all. My mother has asked whether you might join us for lunch tomorrow. She remembers that you mentioned structured routines. She believes Tuesdays should now include tea with you. Claire smiled despite herself. She really remembered that. She has mentioned it every hour since Sunday. There was quiet warmth beneath his measured voice that had not been there before. There is no pressure, he continued. If you are unavailable, I will explain. Claire looked at her schedule. The following afternoon was unusually light after another therapist had volunteered to cover several appointments. I can come for an hour, she replied. Thank you. The call ended as simply as it had begun. The following day, the Romano estate felt less like an intimidating fortress and more like the home of a family trying to preserve normal moments despite unusual circumstances. Eleanor welcomed Claire with unmistakable excitement, proudly showing her a scrapbook filled with old photographs from community charity events, botanical fundraisers, and neighborhood restoration projects stretching back decades. Claire quickly realized something important. Eleanor had spent much of her life supporting hospitals, libraries, parks, and rehabilitation centers. She had quietly helped thousands of strangers long before Claire had ever met her. She never wanted recognition, Sebastian explained while pouring tea. She preferred seeing the results. Claire slowly turned another page and noticed photographs of therapy gardens almost identical to the one outside her own clinic. She understood healing, Claire said softly. Eleanor smiled. Flowers make frightened people breathe slower. They spent nearly an hour talking about gardening, physical rehabilitation, and favorite family recipes before Eleanor excused herself for a short afternoon rest. As one of the housekeepers carefully guided her upstairs, Claire noticed the familiar notebook resting forgotten beside the teapot. She hesitated only briefly before picking it up, intending to return it personally. Several loose pages slipped free onto the table. One page listed upcoming neurological appointments, another contained medication reminders. A third immediately caught Claire's attention because every entry had been crossed out and replaced by dates that did not follow the physician's recommended schedule she had glimpsed inside the clinic envelope days earlier. The handwriting matched the same heavy strokes she had already seen more than once. Sebastian noticed her expression. "What is it?" Claire carefully handed him the page instead of answering immediately. "I cannot be certain," she said quietly. "But someone keeps changing your mother's appointments." Sebastian studied the paper without speaking. "Memory care depends heavily on consistency," Claire continued. "Changing evaluations, routines, or medication reviews without medical guidance can increase confusion. It might be completely innocent. Someone may simply believe they are helping, but it should be checked." Sebastian compared the loose page with another schedule inside a leather folder resting nearby. The dates did not match. His expression remained calm, yet his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "My office receives updated calendars every month," he said. "I assumed they reflected my mother's physicians." Claire shook her head gently. "These are different." Neither of them rushed toward conclusions. Neither accused anyone. They simply looked at two conflicting schedules lying side by side across the polished wooden table. At that exact moment, several rooms away, an estate administrator quietly removed another envelope from a locked filing cabinet before placing it inside a briefcase for delivery. No one in the room realized the original medical recommendations had already been replaced with revised copies weeks earlier. Back in the sitting room, Sebastian slowly folded both schedules together. "Would you be willing to help me understand what my mother actually needs?" he asked. Claire looked toward the staircase where Eleanor had disappeared only minutes before. "I will help her," she answered. "That is different from becoming involved in your family's private affairs." Sebastian accepted the distinction without argument. "Then we begin with my mother." Claire nodded, believing they had agreed on something simple. Neither of them realized that by deciding to compare medical records instead of ignoring small inconsistencies, they had quietly taken the first step toward uncovering a truth someone inside the estate had worked very carefully to keep hidden. Claire Dawson spent the next several days telling herself that she should remain professionally objective. Yet every time she finished another therapy session, her thoughts returned to the two calendars resting side by side on the Romano dining table. The differences were too consistent to dismiss as simple mistakes. Appointment dates had been delayed by weeks. Follow-up evaluations had quietly disappeared. Medication reviews had been shifted without explanation. None of those changes proved malicious intent. But together they formed a pattern that continued bothering her long after she left work each evening. By Friday afternoon, Sebastian Romano called again. His voice remained calm, although she sensed a quiet urgency beneath every carefully chosen word. "I compared every schedule from the past 6 months," he said. "There are more inconsistencies than either of us realized." Claire stood beside the therapy garden outside her clinic, watching two recovering patients practice walking beneath the turning maple leaves. "Did you speak with your mother's neurologist?" she asked. "I did. The physician confirmed several appointments were postponed without his office requesting any changes." Claire remained silent for a moment. Then, someone inside the household must believe those changes were appropriate. That was my first assumption as well, Sebastian replied, but no one admits making them. He paused briefly before continuing. Would you be willing to review my mother's daily routine tomorrow? Not as an investigator, simply as someone who understands memory care better than I do. Claire agreed because the request centered on Eleanor rather than the family's private affairs. The following morning she arrived carrying nothing more than a small notebook, several printed memory exercises, and colored index cards often used with patients experiencing early cognitive decline. Eleanor greeted her with genuine excitement. I have homework today, she announced proudly after seeing the stack of colorful cards. The best kind, Claire answered warmly. They spent nearly 2 hours together inside the bright sunroom overlooking the gardens. Instead of testing Eleanor, Claire encouraged conversations built around familiar photographs, favorite recipes, flower names, and music from earlier decades. The results surprised everyone watching quietly from nearby. Eleanor remembered the exact year she planted the first climbing roses along the eastern wall. She remembered the names of neighborhood children she had once helped through scholarship programs. She even remembered details from a community fundraiser held more than 15 years earlier. Yet when Claire casually asked about appointments scheduled only a few weeks ago, uncertainty immediately returned. Someone tells me when to go, Eleanor said apologetically. I stopped trying to remember because everyone said they would handle it. Claire wrote nothing down for several seconds. That answer troubled her more than forgotten dates. Patients often relied on family for organization, but encouraging complete dependence too early could unintentionally accelerate confusion. After lunch, Eleanor decided to rest while Claire organized the memory exercises into labeled envelopes that could be repeated each morning. Sebastian joined her in the library carrying 2 folders. One contains my mother's original medical schedule, he explained. The other contains the revised versions my office received. Claire carefully compared the pages. Something immediately stood out. The handwriting inside Eleanor's notebook closely matched neither folder. Instead, every altered note appeared copied from separate instruction sheets, prepared by someone else entirely. These revisions were rewritten, Claire observed quietly. Whoever changed the notebook was following another document. Sebastian looked thoughtfully toward the window, which means the notebook may not be where the changes actually began. It was the first real clue that redirected both of them away from their earlier assumptions. Until that moment, Claire had quietly suspected an overprotective assistant. Sebastian had wondered whether a household employee had simply become careless. Now both possibilities seemed less convincing. At that exact moment, less than 50 feet away, an estate administrator entered the records office carrying several newly delivered medical envelopes. He sorted them neatly into separate folders before placing one unopened envelope into a locked cabinet marked personal correspondence. His actions appeared perfectly ordinary to anyone passing the doorway. Unfortunately for him, he did not notice that one envelope remained partially visible beneath the cabinet lid after it closed. Later that afternoon, Eleanor invited Claire to walk once more through the rose garden. As they slowly followed the winding paths, Eleanor suddenly stopped beside the old bronze dedication plaque Claire had shown her days earlier. Someone moved my bench, she said with unexpected certainty. Claire looked around. The stone bench now faced away from the fountain instead of toward it. It seemed like a meaningless landscaping decision until Eleanor quietly added, I always watched the water while waiting for visitors. Claire glanced toward the fountain, then back toward the bench. Small environmental changes often mattered far more than healthy people realized. Familiar orientation helped preserve confidence. She gently asked one of the gardeners when the bench had been relocated. About 4 months ago, he answered, after thinking carefully. We were instructed to turn it during renovations. 4 months, almost the exact period when Eleanor's routines had first begun changing. Claire felt the pieces shifting once again, not into a complete picture, but into one that finally pointed away from coincidence and toward intention. And as the afternoon sunlight faded across the quiet garden, she realized the next answer was probably waiting somewhere inside the estate rather than outside it. The following week unfolded with a quiet sense of purpose neither Claire Dawson nor Sebastian Romano openly acknowledged. They never spoke about solving a mystery. Instead, they focused on helping Eleanor Romano regain the routines that had once made every day feel familiar. Each morning, Claire prepared simple orientation cards with dates, weather, family photographs, and handwritten reminders in large, clear lettering. Every afternoon, Eleanor completed the same gentle exercises, identified flowers in the garden, and recalled stories connected to old family traditions. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. She became less anxious before meals. She hesitated less often while walking through the estate. Most importantly, she began asking to manage parts of her own schedule again. "I think I can write today's date myself," she said one afternoon with quiet determination. Claire handed her the notebook without hesitation. "I know you can." Eleanor carefully wrote the date in slow, steady letters before smiling with unmistakable pride. Sebastian watched from across the room without interrupting. He had spent months believing protection meant doing everything for his mother. Claire had quietly shown him that real support sometimes meant allowing someone to do as much as they still could on their own. Later that afternoon, while Eleanor rested, Claire organized the updated memory routine inside the library. She compared the newest pages in Eleanor's notebook with the original medical recommendations that Sebastian had requested directly from the neurologist's office. This time the differences became even more obvious. Every appointment removed from the schedule involved detailed cognitive evaluations. Routine physical examinations remained unchanged, but specialized memory assessments had repeatedly been delayed or replaced with less comprehensive visits. Claire slowly looked up from the paperwork. "These are not random changes," she said quietly. "Whoever altered the schedule consistently avoided appointments that would measure changes in your mother's memory." Sebastian remained silent for several thoughtful seconds. He did not react with anger. Instead, he calmly reached for another folder containing invoices from the estate's administrative office. "I asked our accounting department for every payment related to my mother's medical care," he explained. Claire noticed several invoices billed for consultations that never appeared anywhere inside the physician's official records. "Somebody approved services that were never performed," she observed. Sebastian nodded almost imperceptibly, and someone expected no one would compare the records. At that exact moment, one floor below, the longtime estate administrator completed another routine afternoon report before placing several folders into the locked records cabinet. He believed every discrepancy had blended naturally into years of paperwork. He never imagined anyone would examine Eleanor's daily routines before reviewing financial records. The first real crack had appeared somewhere he had not anticipated. As evening settled across the estate, Claire joined Eleanor for a slow walk through the gardens one more time. The stone bench had quietly been moved back to its original position facing the fountain after Claire mentioned how important familiar surroundings could be. Eleanor smiled the instant she saw it. "There you are," she whispered to the bench as though greeting an old friend. She sat comfortably, folded her hands in her lap, and watched the water ripple beneath the fading sunlight. "Everything feels right again," she said softly. Claire felt an unexpected warmth hearing those words. Sometimes healing did not arrive through dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes it appeared because someone simply returned a bench to the place where it had always belonged. Sebastian joined them carrying 3 cups of tea prepared exactly the way his mother preferred. Eleanor accepted hers happily before looking toward Claire with unusual clarity. "You know," she said, "people always think kindness is loud. It is usually very quiet." Claire smiled. "I think you have spent your whole life proving that." Eleanor laughed gently before sipping her tea. For several peaceful minutes no one spoke. The fountain provided all the conversation the evening required. Then Sebastian quietly broke the silence. "I received another message from my mother's neurologist this afternoon." Claire turned toward him. "What did he say?" He confirmed that the evaluation originally scheduled 4 months ago was never cancelled by his office. Claire looked down at the notebook resting on Eleanor's lap. 4 months, the same period connected to the altered schedules, the relocated bench, the rewritten reminders, and the beginning of Eleanor's growing dependence. Individual details no longer felt isolated. They formed a single timeline. Sebastian carefully unfolded one final document from his jacket pocket. It was not a financial statement or another medical schedule. It was a visitor authorization log listing every outside appointment requested on Eleanor's behalf during the past year. One signature appeared over and over again beside the cancelled evaluations. The name itself meant nothing to Claire because she had never heard it before, but Sebastian recognized it immediately. His expression remained remarkably calm as he looked at the repeated signature. "I have trusted this person for almost 15 years, he said quietly. Claire did not answer. She simply watched the realization settle across his face. They still did not know why the records had been changed, but for the first time they knew exactly whose decisions had quietly reshaped Eleanor's life. And neither of them realized that by uncovering the name behind the altered schedules, they had already reached the point where the truth could no longer remain hidden for much longer. Morning sunlight spread across the Romano estate with a calmness that felt almost undeserved after so many quiet discoveries. The gardens looked unchanged. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm. Eleanor Romano greeted every member of the household with the same warm smile she had carried for years. To anyone visiting for the first time, nothing appeared unusual. Only Claire Dawson and Sebastian Romano knew that beneath the peaceful routine, a pattern had finally begun revealing itself. They met in the library before breakfast, where the visitor authorization log rested beside the original medical records and Eleanor's handwritten notebook. None of the documents alone proved wrongdoing. Together, they told a story that neither of them could ignore. Claire slowly organized every page by date until a clear timeline emerged. 4 months earlier, the neurological evaluations had begun disappearing from Eleanor's calendar. During that same period, orientation routines had quietly changed, familiar landmarks inside the estate had been rearranged, and official reports describing Eleanor's condition had become increasingly inconsistent with the physician's own records. Sebastian studied the documents without speaking. His silence was heavier than frustration because it carried disappointment instead. The repeated signature belonged to Arthur Gaines, the estate administrator who had worked for the Romano family for nearly 15 years. Arthur had overseen household operations with quiet efficiency for so long that few people questioned his decisions. He remembered birthdays, coordinated renovations, managed charitable donations, and arranged Eleanor's appointments whenever Sebastian traveled for business. Trust had accumulated slowly over the years, making doubt almost impossible. "I need facts," Sebastian finally said, "not assumptions." Claire nodded. "Then ask the people who never expected to be asked." Rather than confronting Arthur immediately, Sebastian requested copies of every appointment confirmation directly from Eleanor's neurologist, the transportation company, and the estate reception desk. Throughout the day, small details began aligning with remarkable consistency. The physician's office confirmed that several evaluations had been postponed after receiving telephone requests from someone claiming to represent Eleanor personally. The transportation records showed drivers had arrived for appointments that Eleanor never attended because they had already been redirected elsewhere. Reception logs revealed visitors arriving on dates that no longer matched the official household calendar. None of the employees had acted dishonestly. Each department believed another office had already verified the changes. The confusion had spread quietly because everyone trusted the same administrator. That afternoon, Sebastian invited Arthur into the library. Claire remained nearby only because she had been reviewing Eleanor's memory exercises and did not wish to interfere unless asked. Arthur entered carrying his usual leather portfolio and greeted both of them with complete confidence. Sebastian calmly placed the visitor authorization log beside the physician's original schedule. "Could you help me understand these differences?" he asked. Arthur adjusted his glasses and examined the paperwork carefully. "Mrs. Romano became increasingly forgetful several months ago," he explained. "I believed reducing lengthy evaluations would make her less anxious. I also simplified her routine to avoid overwhelming her." Claire listened quietly. The explanation sounded compassionate until she compared it with everything she had learned while working with memory care patients. "Did her neurologist recommend those changes?" she asked gently. Arthur hesitated for the first time, not specifically. Then who did? Silence settled over the room. It was not the silence of guilt alone. It was the silence of someone realizing that good intentions had slowly grown into harmful decisions. Arthur lowered his eyes toward the paperwork. "I thought I was protecting her," he admitted softly. Each difficult evaluation upset her for days. Every disappointing test seemed to take away another piece of her confidence. "I convinced myself that fewer appointments would help her enjoy whatever time remained." Claire looked toward Eleanor's notebook resting on the table. Instead, she said with kindness rather than accusation, she stopped trusting her own memory because everyone else began making every decision for her. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. I never intended that. Sebastian remained remarkably composed. Did you benefit financially from any of these changes? Arthur answered immediately. No. The accounting record supported his answer. There had been administrative confusion and unnecessary medical billing caused by repeated scheduling errors, but no evidence suggested personal enrichment. The problem had never been greed, it had been misplaced certainty. Arthur believed he understood what Eleanor needed better than her physicians did. Unfortunately, that belief had quietly stolen months of specialized care. Sebastian stood and walked toward the library window overlooking the restored garden bench beside the fountain. After a long moment, he spoke without turning around. You served this family faithfully for many years, but trust requires humility. The moment you decided you knew better than everyone else, you stopped protecting my mother. Arthur's shoulders lowered. He offered his resignation without argument. Sebastian accepted it with dignity and promised to assist him in transitioning peacefully out of the estate after cooperating fully with Eleanor's physicians to restore accurate records. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Only the quiet recognition that even sincere intentions could cause lasting harm when they replaced professional guidance. As Arthur left the library carrying his portfolio for the final time, Claire looked toward the open garden where Eleanor laughed softly while arranging fresh flowers exactly as she had years before. The mystery had finally been solved, but watching Eleanor rediscover small pieces of her independence made Claire realize that finding the truth had never been the real victory. Helping Eleanor reclaim confidence one ordinary day at a time would become the far greater challenge. And standing beside the window, Sebastian quietly reached for the stack of new therapy cards Claire had prepared, knowing exactly where he intended to begin. The days that followed brought a different kind of peace to the Romano estate, one built not on perfect certainty but on honest routine. Every outdated appointment had been corrected. Eleanor Romano's neurologist resumed the evaluation schedule exactly as originally recommended, and each visit was now carefully coordinated with the therapy exercises Claire Dawson had designed specifically for Eleanor's daily life. Instead of overwhelming her with constant reminders about what she had forgotten, everyone focused on strengthening what she still remembered. The change seemed almost invisible at first. Eleanor began choosing her own clothes each morning again. She returned to watering the roses outside the conservatory every afternoon. She once again insisted on writing handwritten birthday cards for local children's charities, occasionally asking for help with a word but refusing to surrender the pen. Claire smiled every time she watched those small victories. Healing did not always mean reversing an illness. Sometimes healing simply meant giving someone back the confidence to keep living fully despite it. Sebastian Romano noticed the difference as clearly as anyone. His mother laughed more often. She walked through the gardens without looking over her shoulder in confusion. Even when memory failed her, she no longer looked embarrassed. She simply accepted gentle guidance before continuing forward. One quiet afternoon he found Claire sitting beside the restored fountain while Eleanor arranged fresh flowers nearby. The autumn air carried the scent of roses and fallen leaves across the estate. For several moments neither of them spoke. The peaceful silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Sebastian broke it. I spent months believing I could solve every problem by taking control, he admitted quietly. Claire watched Eleanor smile at one of the gardeners before answering. Control and care are not always the same thing. Sebastian nodded slowly. You understood that before I did. Claire looked toward the fountain where sunlight danced across the water. I only understood because I have watched families make the same mistake before. Loving someone very much sometimes makes people forget to ask what that person still wants. Sebastian remained thoughtful for several seconds before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He carefully placed a folded document on the bench between them. Claire opened it with visible curiosity. It was not a check, it was not a contract. It was the architectural proposal for a new memory therapy garden that Sebastian intended to build beside the rehabilitation clinic where Claire worked. The plans included accessible walking paths, sensory flower beds, shaded seating markers, and outdoor therapy spaces designed specifically for patients living with memory disorders. At the bottom of the page, one handwritten sentence stood alone, dedicated to every family learning that kindness is part of treatment. Claire stared at the drawings in complete silence. "This is too much," she finally whispered. Sebastian gently shook his head. "No, it is finally the right thing." She looked up at him. "I told you from the beginning that I did not help your mother expecting anything in return." "I know," he answered. "That is exactly why this should never belong to either of us. It belongs to everyone who will someday walk through it." Claire slowly smiled. For the first time since they had met beneath the rain, she accepted what he offered because it was no longer about repaying a debt. It had become an opportunity to help countless strangers neither of them would ever meet. Nearby, Eleanor quietly watched the conversation unfold from the rose garden. She walked toward them carrying a single white bloom before placing it gently into Claire's hands. "I remembered something today," she said proudly. Claire looked up with encouraging warmth. "What did you remember?" Eleanor smiled toward her son before answering. "I remembered that the people who change our lives almost never arrive looking important." Sebastian lowered his eyes with a quiet smile while Claire carefully tucked the white rose inside the notebook she carried everywhere. Less than a week later, construction crews began preparing the clinic grounds for the new therapy garden. There were no newspaper announcements and no elaborate ceremonies. Sebastian requested that the donation remain anonymous except for one small bronze plaque placed beside the entrance. It did not mention the Romano family. It did not mention wealth or recognition. It simply read, "May every person who enters here remember that dignity grows where kindness is given time." On the morning the first flowers were planted, Eleanor arrived carrying gardening gloves she insisted on wearing herself. Claire guided her toward the freshly prepared soil, and together they planted the very first white rose beneath the soft light of an October sunrise. Watching them work side by side, Sebastian realized something he had never understood through years of influence: responsibility or power. The greatest legacy a person could leave behind was not measured by what they owned, but by how many lives quietly became gentler because they had chosen to care. 1 year later, the first cool rain of autumn returned to northern New Jersey with the same gentle rhythm that had quietly changed 3 lives forever. Water shimmered across the sidewalks outside the rehabilitation clinic, and the therapy garden bloomed with white roses despite the changing season. Patients slowly followed the winding, accessible paths. Family members sat together beneath shaded benches, and laughter drifted through the flower beds where fear had once been replaced by hope, one small step at a time. Claire Dawson stood near the entrance helping an elderly patient finish her morning exercises before watching the woman proudly walk the final few feet without assistance. The applause came naturally from everyone nearby, and Claire smiled with the same quiet satisfaction she had carried since the very beginning. Some victories would never make headlines, but they mattered anyway. Across the garden, Eleanor Romano carefully watered the first white rose she and Claire had planted months earlier. Her memory still wandered from time to time, and some mornings remained more difficult than others, but her confidence had returned in ways no medical chart could fully measure. She greeted volunteers by name more often than not. She remembered where her favorite bench belonged. She laughed whenever children visited the sensory garden, insisting they always deserved the brightest flowers. The illness had not disappeared, but it no longer defined every moment of her life. Sir Sebastian Romano watched quietly from a respectful distance before walking toward them carrying 3 warm cups of tea. Unlike the first night Claire had met him, there were no long lines of black vehicles surrounding him today. Only one dark sedan rested beneath a nearby oak tree, parked beside Claire's aging car without either vehicle seeming out of place. He handed 1 cup to his mother and another to Claire before taking a seat on the restored stone bench overlooking the fountain. For a while, none of them spoke. The fountain provided the familiar music of flowing water while autumn leaves drifted across the garden, paths exactly as they had inside the Romano estate months before. Finally, Eleanor looked from her son to Claire with the playful smile that always appeared whenever she believed she had discovered something before everyone else. "You spend a great deal of time together," she observed. Claire laughed softly while lowering her eyes toward the steaming tea. Sebastian answered with unusual honesty, "I like spending time with her." Eleanor nodded as though confirming something she had known for weeks. "Good. Life is too short to keep important things waiting." After finishing her tea, she wandered toward a nearby flower bed to help a volunteer arrange fresh blossoms, leaving the 2 of them sitting quietly beside the fountain. Claire watched Eleanor for a long moment before speaking. She seems happier. Sebastian smiled gently. She reminds me every morning that I should stop trying to solve tomorrow before enjoying today. Claire turned toward him. That sounds like good advice. He nodded. It came from you, even if she does not remember where she first heard it. They shared an easy silence that no longer needed careful explanations. Months earlier, every conversation between them had revolved around uncertainty, schedules, forgotten appointments, and quiet suspicions. Now they spoke about patients, gardens, weather, recipes Eleanor wanted to try again, and plans for expanding the therapy program so more families could receive support. Their lives had slowly woven together without either of them forcing the change. Sebastian finally reached into his coat pocket and removed a small folded photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. Claire immediately recognized the image. It showed a lonely streetlight glowing through heavy rain beside an empty sidewalk. One of the security cameras captured this the night everything began, he explained. I asked someone to print it. Claire studied the photograph before smiling. It does not look very remarkable. It did not seem remarkable that night either, Sebastian replied quietly, until someone decided to stop. Claire looked back toward the garden where Eleanor was now laughing with several patients, while carefully showing them how deeply to plant new flowers. Funny how the smallest decision can change so much. Sebastian folded the photograph again before placing it back into his pocket. You once told me that not every debt could be repaid with gifts. Claire nodded. I remember. He looked toward the therapy garden surrounding them. You were right. Kindness is not something people repay. It is something they continue. Claire reached over and gently rested her hand beside his on the weathered stone bench. Neither of them rushed the quiet moment. Neither of them needed dramatic promises. The life they were building had already become the answer. As the afternoon slowly faded, Eleanor called them both toward the newest flower bed, where 3 empty spaces waited beneath the white roses. Together they knelt in the soft earth and planted 3 young rose bushes side by side. When they finished, a light rain began falling once more, just enough to settle the fresh soil around the roots. Claire looked toward the familiar street beyond the clinic gates where a single elderly woman carrying an umbrella carefully crossed the sidewalk with help from a stranger who had stopped without hesitation. She smiled because the scene felt strangely familiar. A year earlier she had been the one offering that helping hand beneath another rainy sky. Now she simply watched kindness continue its quiet journey through someone else's ordinary day, and beneath the soft autumn rain, beside one modest sedan and one dark car parked without distance between them, the story came gently full circle, proving that the most extraordinary lives are often changed not by power but by the simple decision to help someone find the way home.